The wind howled through Coldwater's narrow streets, kicking up dust and ash from the mining camp's dying fires. The auction block stood at the town's heart, a splintered platform worn smooth by years of hard deals. She stood at the crowd's edge, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, her face half hidden by the frayed wool. Her name was Clara, though few in town bothered to use it. Widow, they called her, as if her loss defined her more than her 32 years of living. In her pocket, 3 silver dollars clinked, her last coins from selling her husband's rusted tools. She'd come to claim something, though she didn't yet know what. The man on the block was a stranger to most, but his name carried weight. They called him Wild Cane, a trapper who'd lived too long among the pines and wolves. His beard was thick, his shoulders broad under a tattered coat, his wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into his skin. A fresh scar ran above his left brow, red and jagged, catching the noon sun. The crowd whispered of his deeds: a man killed in a bar fight, a bear driven off with a broken knife. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, swept the square, not pleading, not defiant, just steady. Clara felt them linger on her for a moment, and her breath caught. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip, calling for bids. $1 was offered, then 2, the voices thin and hesitant. No one wanted trouble, and Cain was trouble wrapped in flesh. Clara's hand stayed still, her fingers tracing the coins in her pocket. She saw the way he stood, not slumped but rooted, like a pine weathering a gale. She'd known men like him, men who carried ghosts in their silence. Her husband had been one, before the fever took him and left her alone in a cabin too big for one. The gavel hovered. The auctioneer spat into the dust, impatient. Clara's hand rose, steady as stone, her $3 offered without a word. The crowd turned, murmurs rippling like wind through grass. A woman alone, buying a man like that? The auctioneer squinted, then nodded, slamming the gavel down. The deal was done. Cain stepped off the block, his boots heavy on the wood, and followed her to the wagon waiting at the square's edge. No one spoke to her as she climbed up, the reins cold in her hands. The road to her cabin stretched long, winding through foothills dusted with early snow. Cain sat beside her, his bound hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wagon creaked under their weight, the mule's breath steaming in the air. Clara kept her eyes on the path, her jaw tight. She didn't know why she'd done it. $3 for a man who might kill her in her sleep or vanish by dawn. But something in his silence matched her own, a shared language of loss she couldn't name. Her cabin came into view at dusk, a low structure of logs and mud, its chimney trailing thin smoke. She stopped the wagon, climbed down, and cut the rope from Cain's wrist with a small knife from her belt. He rubbed the raw skin, his fingers slow, deliberate. She pointed to the barn, then to a corner inside the cabin where a blanket lay folded on a chair. He nodded, his face unreadable, and carried his weight into the barn to tend the mule. Clara watched him go, her hand still gripping the knife. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and the faint tang of lye soap. She stirred the fire, the logs hissing as flames caught. Cain returned, his boots leaving wet tracks on the floorboards. She set a tin cup of coffee before him, black and steaming, and a plate of cornbread. He ate slowly, his movements careful, as if he hadn't touched a meal in days. Clara sat across from him, her own plate untouched, her hands folded in her lap. The firelight danced on the walls, casting their shadows long and thin. Once their eyes met, and she saw something flicker in his, a question, maybe, or a memory he didn't share. Night fell heavy, the wind rattling the shutters. Cain settled in the corner, his back to the wall, the blanket pulled over his shoulders. Clara lay in her bed across the room, the quilt heavy on her chest. She listened to his breathing, slow and even, and wondered what kind of man she'd brought into her home. The fire died to embers, and sleep came hard, her dreams filled with snow and the sound of a gavel falling. By morning, Cain was gone from the corner. Clara found him outside, splitting wood with an axe he'd found in the barn. The blade bit into the logs with a clean, rhythmic thud. She watched from the porch, her shawl loose around her shoulders. He didn't look up, but she saw the way his hands gripped the handle, steady despite the scars crisscrossing his knuckles. She turned back inside, her heart a little less heavy, and started the fire for breakfast. The days began to blur, a quiet rhythm settling between them. Kane worked without being asked, mending the barn door, clearing snow from the path. Clara darned his coat, her stitches small and precise, the needle flashing in the lamplight. One evening, she found a small wooden spoon on the table, its handle smoothed by his knife. She ran her thumb over it, feeling the care in its curves, and set it beside her plate without a word. Winter deepened, the snow piling high against the cabin walls. Clara caught a cough, her chest tight with each breath. Kane noticed, though he didn't speak. He boiled water, steeped pine needles into a bitter tea, and set it by her bed. She drank it, her eyes on the ceiling, his presence a shadow in the room. The cough eased, and she slept, her dreams softer now, filled with the scent of pine. One night, by the fire, Clara's hair fell loose from its braid, the strands catching the light. Kane watched her from across the room, his hand still on a piece of wood he'd been carving. He rose, slow and quiet, and knelt beside her. His fingers, rough from years in the wild, moved with care as he gathered her hair, weaving it into a braid tight and neat. She froze, her breath shallow, but didn't pull away. When he finished, he stepped back, his eyes on the floor. Clara touched the braid, her fingers trembling, and felt something shift inside her, a trust she hadn't known she could still give. The mountain air grew sharper as winter tightened its hold, the snow piling high against Clara's cabin, sealing them in a world of white. Kane rose before dawn each day, his silhouette moving through the gray light, checking traps or clearing the path to the barn. His hands, scarred and calloused, worked with a quiet purpose that filled the silence left by words unspoken. Clara watched him from the window, her breath fogging the glass, her fingers tracing the wooden spoon he'd carved, now a fixture beside her plate. The cabin became their shared refuge, a fragile rhythm settling into their days. Clara boiled coffee over the fire, the scent mingling with the pine smoke that clung to the walls. Kane repaired a loose shutter, his hammer strikes steady, deliberate. Once, as he carried firewood inside, a log slipped, and Clara caught it before it hit the floor. Their hands brushed, brief and warm, and she turned away, her face flushed, stirring the stew with more force than needed. Kane said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than before. The snow fell heavier, the world outside shrinking to the cabin's four walls. Clara's cough lingered, though milder now, and Kane kept the fire high, stacking logs with care to chase the chill from the room. One evening, as the wind howled, he pulled a small knife from his belt and began carving a piece of pine. Clara watched, her needle pausing over a patch on his coat. The shavings curled to the floor, and by the fire's light, a tiny bird took shape in his hands, its wings half spread as if ready to fly. He set it on the table without a glance, and Clara touched its edges, her fingers soft, a faint smile breaking her guarded face. Nights grew longer, the fire their only light. Clara found herself watching Kane as he sat by the hearth, his head bowed, his hands still. She saw the weight he carried, the way his shoulders tensed when the wind mimicked a distant cry. Once, as she passed him a tin of coffee, their fingers met again, and this time neither pulled away. The touch lingered, a quiet pulse in the room, and Clara felt her heart stir, a feeling she'd buried with her husband's boots 2 winters past. One morning, the snow stopped, leaving a silence so deep it felt alive. Kane stood outside, his breath clouding as he stared at the mountains, their peaks sharp against the sky. Clara joined him, her shawl loose, her boots sinking into the fresh drift. She saw the locket in his hand again, its chain still broken, its surface dulled by time. He didn't hide it, but he didn't speak of it either. Clara's hand moved, almost on its own, to rest on his arm. He stiffened, then relaxed, and they stood there, the cold biting their faces, the locket a silent bridge between their pasts. The days stretched on, each one weaving them closer. Kane fixed a leak in a roof, his hands steady on the ladder as Clara held it far below. She baked cornbread, leaving an extra piece by his plate, and he ate it slowly, his eyes meeting hers across the table. One night, as the fire burned low, Clara found a name scratched into the table's edge. Lila, carved shallow but clear. She didn't ask, but her fingers traced the letters, and she wondered who Lila had been to him. Kane watched her, his face unreadable, and turned back to the fire. A storm came, fierce and sudden, rattling the cabin like a warning. Clara woke to find Kane gone, his blanket folded neatly in the corner. Panic gripped her, sharp and cold, until she saw him through the window, wrestling a tarp over the barn to shield the mule. He returned soaked, his coat heavy with snow, and Clara handed him a dry shirt, her husband's, kept in a trunk all this time. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, and changed by the fire, his back to her. The shirt fit poorly, too tight across his shoulders, but he wore it without complaint. The storm passed, leaving the world buried deeper in white. Kane took to repairing traps, his knife flashing as he tightened sinew and wood. Clara watched, her hands busy with mending, and noticed the way he paused sometimes, staring at nothing, his jaw tight. She began leaving small things for him, a mug of tea, a folded blanket, gestures that spoke louder than words. One evening, she found a second carving beside the bird, a tiny horse, its legs sturdy, its head proud. She set it on the mantel, next to the bird, and felt the cabin grow fuller, as if it held more than just the two of them. Clara's cough faded, but a new ache settled in her chest. Not illness, but something softer, heavier. She caught herself watching Kane as he worked, noting the lines etched around his eyes, the way his hands moved with care despite their strength. One night, as she braided her hair by the fire, he watched her, his carving knife still. He rose, slow and quiet, and took the strands from her hands. His fingers wove the braid with the same care he'd given the bird, the horse, the traps. Clara sat still, her breath shallow, feeling the weight of his touch, the trust it carried. When he finished, he stepped back, and she touched the braid, her heart pounding in the quiet. The thaw came early, patches of earth breaking through the snow. Kane stood by the creek one morning, the locket in his hand again, its chain glinting in the weak sun. Clara watched from the porch, her shawl slipping to her elbows. She saw the way he held it, not with anger, but with a grief that ran deep like a river under ice. She stepped closer, her boots soft on the ground, and stood beside him. He didn't turn, but he didn't pull away either. The water rushed past, cold and clear, carrying their silence downstream. Spring crept in slow, the snow melting in rivulets that carved paths down the mountain slopes. The creek swelled with runoff, its waters rushing clear and cold past Clara's cabin. Kane worked the traps early, his boots sinking into the softening earth, his rifle slung over one shoulder. He returned at midday with a brace of rabbits, skinned them by the barn, his knife moving with practiced ease. Clara watched from the porch, her hands busy shelling peas, noting the way the sun caught the gray in his beard, the scars on his hands fading slightly with time. The cabin felt different now, the air lighter, the silence between them comfortable rather than heavy. Clara planted seeds in the small garden patch, her fingers pressing into the damp soil. Kane joined her without a word, kneeling beside her to stake the rows, his presence steady. Once, as they worked, their arms brushed, and she didn't pull away. He paused, his eyes meeting hers, a faint warmth in the gray depths. Clara turned back to the earth, her heart quickening, the seeds taking root in more ways than one. Evenings lengthened, the fire needed less as the days warmed. Kane carved more figures, a deer, its antlers branching like trees, and left them on the mantel. Clara arranged them carefully, her fingers lingering on each one, feeling the stories etched in the wood. One night, as the stars pricked the sky, she found him outside, the locket open in his palm. Inside, a faded photograph of a woman, her hair braided much like Clara's. He didn't close it when she approached, just held it steady. Clara sat beside him on the porch step, her shoulder touching his, and they stared at the image together, the night air soft around them. The bond grew in quiet gestures. Clara mended a tear in his shirt, her stitches neat, and he wore it the next day without comment. He fixed the wagon wheel, his hands strong on the spokes, and she brought him water, their fingers touching over the cup. The touches lingered longer now, a hand on an arm, a brush of shoulders by the fire. Clara felt the walls around her heart cracking, the loss of her husband softening into memory rather than ache. Kane's eyes held less shadow, his movements easier, as if the mountain's weight lifted slightly. One afternoon, a stranger rode up the path, his horse lathered, his face hard. He asked after Wild Kane, his voice low, his hand resting on his pistol. Clara stood on the porch, her shawl tight, her eyes steady. Kane emerged from the barn, his axe in hand, his stance rooted. The stranger spoke of old debts, a bar fight gone wrong, a brother buried in cold water. Kane didn't flinch, just set the axe down and faced him. Clara's heart pounded, but she stepped forward, her hand on Kane's arm. The stranger eyed them, then turned his horse, riding off without another word. Kane watched him go, then turned to Clara, his eyes soft. She squeezed his arm, and they returned to the cabin, the threat fading like smoke. Summer hinted at the edges, wildflowers blooming in patches along the creek. Clara walked there one morning, her basket empty, her mind full. Kane followed at a distance, then joined her, his boots quiet on the grass. They sat by the water, the sun warm on their faces. He pulled a locket from his pocket, the chain mended now with a bit of wire. He handed it to her, his fingers rough. Clara opened it, saw the woman, Lila, she guessed, and felt a pang of understanding. Kane's hand covered hers, a silent sharing of grief. She closed the locket, handed it back, and they sat longer, the water murmuring their unspoken words. The days filled with work and quiet companionship. Kane built a new shelf in the cabin, his hammer rhythmic. Clara stocked it with jars of preserves, her hand efficient. One evening, as rain pattered on the roof, she found a name carved into the shelf's edge, Clara, beside Lila's faint trace on the table. She traced both, her eyes misting, and Kane watched from the corner, his carving knife still. He rose, crossed the room, and stood before her. His hand lifted, cupping her cheek, his thumb rough but gentle. Clara leaned into it, her breath catching, the rain a soft backdrop to the moment. Trust deepened, the past weaving into the present. Clara shared her husband's old pipe, left on the mantel, and Kane held it, turning it in his hands. He didn't smoke it, but set it beside his carvings, a nod to what was lost. She found him one night by the fire, his shoulders slumped, and sat beside him, her hand on his knee. He covered it with his own, and they stayed that way, the fire crackling, the silence full of healing. Autumn whispered in the turning leaves, but summer held on. Kane hunted deeper in the woods, returning with game and stories told in glances. Clara prepared the meals, her braids swinging as she worked. He wove it for her again one evening, his fingers sure, the act a ritual now. She touched it after, her eyes meeting his, a quiet promise in the air. The cabin, once empty, now held life, two souls finding redemption in the quiet spaces between. Autumn winds swept through the valley, carrying the scent of turning leaves and distant rain. The creek ran lower now, its banks lined with golden aspen that shivered in the breeze. Kane hunted deeper into the woods, his steps silent on the fallen needles, returning with deer hides and meat for the winter ahead. Clara salted the cuts by the barn, her hands steady, her braids swinging gently as she worked. She glanced up as he approached, their eyes meeting in a way that had become familiar, a quiet acknowledgement of the life they shared. The cabin stood solid against the changing season, its logs weathered but warm. Kane reinforced the roof, his hammer echoing through the crisp air. Clara gathered herbs from the garden, drying them in bundles that hung from the rafters. One afternoon, as clouds gathered, she found him carving again, a small cabin, miniature and precise, left on the windowsill. She touched its tiny door, imagining it opening to a world like theirs, and set it beside the other figures on the mantel, each one a piece of their unspoken story. Nights cooled, the fire blazing higher to ward off the chill. Clara sat by the hearth, mending a blanket, her needle flashing in the light. Kane joined her, his presence a steady warmth. He reached for her hair, unbraiding it slowly, his fingers combing through the strands with care. She leaned back, her eyes closing, feeling the tension of the day ease under his touch. When he re-wove it, tighter this time, she turned to him, her hand on his cheek, rough with beard. Their gazes held, the fire reflecting in their eyes, a depth of feeling passing between them without words. The first frost came, silvering the ground like a warning. Kane rose early, checking the traps, his breath visible in the dawn light. Clara watched from the porch, her shawl wrapped close, a mug of coffee steaming in her hands. She set another beside the door for him, and when he returned, he took it, their fingers lingering. The touch sent a warmth through her, chasing the frost from her bones. He nodded, slight but meaningful, and they shared the morning silence, the mountains watching over them. A traveler passed through one day, his wagon creaking up the path. He sought directions, his voice rough from the road. Kane stood by Clara, his stance protective, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The traveler eyed them, noting the quiet bond, and moved on without lingering. Clara felt Kane's hand tighten briefly, then relax, a gesture of possession and care. She leaned into him, her head against his arm, and they watched the wagon fade into the trees, the path empty once more. Winter loomed, the days shortening like drawn curtains. Kane stacked wood higher, his axe biting deep into the logs. Clara baked bread, the scent filling the cabin, drawing him inside earlier than usual. They ate by the fire, their knees touching under the table, the clink of forks a soft rhythm. One evening, as snow flurried outside, he pulled the locket from his pocket and placed it in her hand. Clara opened it, saw Lila's face, and understood the gift. Not just the object, but the trust. She closed it, hung it around her neck, and his hand covered hers over it, warm and sure. The snow fell steady, blanketing the world in white again. Clara fell ill once more, a fever gripping her tight. Kane tended her, his brow furrowed, his hands gentle with cloths and tea. He sat by her bed through the nights, his shadow steady on the wall. When the fever broke, she woke to find him asleep in the chair, his head bowed. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, and he stirred, his eyes opening to hers. The look they shared held gratitude and something deeper, a quiet love forged in the fire of shared trials. Spring would come again, but for now, they held to the rhythm of their days. Kane repaired the garden fence, his work methodical. Clara planted new seeds, her hands in the earth beside his. Their touches grew bolder, a hand on the back, a brush of lips on a forehead. The carvings multiplied, a menagerie on the mantel, each one a testament to his heart. Clara added her own touch, sewing a small quilt for the figures, draping it over the tiny cabin. The bond strengthened, unbreakable now. Kane wove her hair each night, the act a ritual of care. Clara traced the scars on his hands, learning their stories through touch. The past faded, not forgotten but softened, making room for the present. The cabin, once a shelter from loss, became a home of renewal, their lives intertwined like the braids he wove. As the seasons turned, whispers from town reached them, a bounty on wild cane, old grudges stirring. Clara saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the horizon. She stood beside him, her hand in his, ready to face whatever came. Their quiet life, claimed for $3, had become priceless, a testament to second chances and silent love. Winter returned with a vengeance, the snow falling thick and unrelenting, burying the path to cold water under drifts that reached the cabin's eaves. Kane shoveled a narrow trail to the barn each morning, his breath steaming, his shoulders straining under the weight. Clara watched from the window, her hand on the glass, fogging it with her warmth. The locket hung around her neck now, a constant reminder of shared ghosts, its chain cool against her skin. The cabin held them close, the fire their anchor in the storm. Kane wove her hair by the hearth each evening, his fingers deft, the act a silent vow. Clara leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise of his chest. They shared the blanket, their bodies finding comfort in the quiet, the wind howling outside like forgotten regrets. One night, as embers glowed, he traced her palm with his thumb, mapping scars of her own, calluses from work, lines from loss. She closed her hand around his, holding tight. Rumors from town filtered in with a rare visitor, a trapper seeking shelter. He spoke of the bounty growing, old enemies stirring in the saloons. Kane listened without expression, his jaw set. The visitor left at dawn, and Clara saw the shadow return to Kane's eyes, the weight settling back. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch a question. He covered it with his own, but his gaze drifted to the mountains, distant and cold. The days shortened further, the sun a brief visitor. Kane hunted less, staying closer to the cabin, his rifle always near. Clara baked and mended, her movements deliberate, but her mind raced. She found him one afternoon by the creek, now frozen solid, staring at the ice. The locket was in his hand again, but he snapped it shut when she approached. She stood beside him, her breath mingling with his, and slipped her hand into his pocket, finding his fist clenched. He relaxed, entwining their fingers, and they walked back together, the snow crunching underfoot. A storm brewed, darker than before. Kane reinforced the shutters, his hammer urgent. Clara stalked the fire, her arms full of logs. As night fell, riders appeared on the horizon, shadows against the white. 3 men, coats flapping, rifles glinting. Kane stepped out, his own gun ready, his stance unyielding. Clara followed, standing beside him, her hand on his back. The leader called out, voice cutting the wind, debts to settle, blood for blood. Kane didn't move, his eyes steady. The men dismounted, boots sinking in snow. Clara felt fear grip her, but she didn't retreat. One man raised his rifle, and Kane shifted, shielding her. A shot rang out, echoing off the mountains. Kane staggered, blood blooming on his shoulder. He fired back, dropping one rider. The others hesitated, then charged. Clara grabbed the axe from the porch, swinging it with force born of desperation. She struck one's arm, the crack of bone loud. Kane took down the second, his shots precise despite the wound. The leader fled, horse bolting into the storm. Kane slumped against the cabin wall, his face pale. Clara dragged him inside, her hands slick with blood. She bound the wound, her fingers trembling but sure, using strips from her shawl. He watched her, his eyes soft, a faint smile breaking through the pain. She pressed her forehead to his, tears mixing with sweat, and held him through the night. Dawn broke clear, the storm passed. Kane's fever rose, but Clara tended him, her care unwavering. Days blurred, the cabin a cocoon of healing. When he mended, slower than before, he carved one last figure, a woman with braided hair, standing beside a man with scars. He set it on the mantel, completing the scene. Spring thawed the ice, the creek rushing anew. Kane stood on the porch, his shoulders stiff but strong. Clara joined him, her hand in his. The path to town lay open, but he didn't take it. Instead, he carved their names into the doorpost, Clara and Kane side by side. She touched the letters, her heart full. They stayed, building a life from the quiet, a family forged in silence and strength. The mountain man once called wild had found his anchor, claimed not by dollars but by trust. Clara, the widow who bid 3 coins, had woven a new beginning. Their story lingered in the pines, a testament to redemption and love unspoken. If this story stirred something in you, subscribe for more tales of quiet redemption. Hit that like button and share in the comments. What moment hooked you, or what kind of Western heart would you want to see next?